During a few days, at the end of March 1926, a series of very confused and unclear events suddenly carry Chiang Kai-shek to the top of the Chinese Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang, and paves the way for him to unite China in a way unseen since before the First World War. Welcome to Between Two Wars, a chronological summary of the interwar years, covering all facets of life, the uncertainty, hedonism, and euphoria, and ultimately humanity's descent into the darkness of the Second World War. I'm Indy Neidell. When we left China in our second 1925 episode, Sun Yat-sen, the father of the Chinese Republic, had just died, leaving a divided Kuomintang already split into left and right factions, but also in a union with the CPC, the Communist Party of China. This somewhat unorthodox alliance was born from the necessity for foreign support to be able to wage a war against the warlords of the North to unite China under Kuomintang control. You see, the only major international power willing to provide arms and finances for Sun Yat-sen's proposed northern expedition to defeat these warlords vying for control over the Beiyang government was the USSR. The Soviets hoped to twist the Kuomintang left flank closer to the communists, push aside the right flank. The ultimate goal is a united China that would join the Socialist International, considerably strengthening both the economic and military power of the communist movement. Well, this idea hinges on that the factions of the Kuomintang and the CPC play nice with each other. A plan with a fairly high risk of failure. And expectedly, as soon as Sun Yat-sen dies, the party starts falling apart, thereby also threatening the United Front. With Sun gone, the party's leadership is in the hands of three very different men. Wang Jingwei, Sun's closest collaborator and leader of the left faction of the party, Hu Hanmin, on the far right wing of the party, also a close advisor to Sun, but an advocate of a much more unilateral conservative party than Sun had envisioned. Between the two is the US-born pragmatist and moderate finance minister Liao Zhongkai, a strong believer in Sun's legacy and the architect of the Communist alliance and cooperation with the Soviets. While the three party leaders continue to officially work together, ostensibly still preparing for the Northern Expedition, lesser leaders of the party fight petty regional wars with each other and independent warlords to increase their regional control within the southern half of China that they are trying to govern. It is a situation of more or less constant war that has to end to enable the Northern Expedition. And Chiang Kai-shek is building a new army through the Soviet-financed Wampol Military Academy, with the goal of uniting these warring factions or to defeat the ones that just won't fall in line. In April, only weeks after Sun's death, the Wampol force is transformed into the official Kuomintang Party Army with home base in Guangzhou, capital of the Guangdong province. Both the city and the province are known at the time in English as Canton. Despite initially having only 3,000 men, Chiang fights successfully in a series of campaigns and defensive battles against the regional warlords. By the end of 1925, he is firmly in control of Guangdong. On the way, he has captured at least 28,600 rifles, 220 machine guns, 30 artillery pieces, 6 gunboats, and more than 10 million cartridges. He's also rolled up new recruits and pressed some of the warlords into alliances with his army. He is now a force with which to be reckoned, and suddenly the prospect of a northern expedition looks more realistic. This is welcome news, especially to the Soviets, who have seen their other ally in China falter. They are the recently formed Kuomintang, the National People's Army in the Northwest, a warlord faction formed by Feng Yushang, a Christian socialist, nationalist, and distinctly elusive figure in Chinese history. To everyone's surprise, in October 1924, roughly a year ago, Feng catapulted himself onto the national stage by suddenly mounting a coup, seizing control of the capital Beijing, and ousting the Zhili from power. His reasons for doing so are still unclear and range from possibly dissatisfaction with Zhili leadership to a bribe by the Japanese or promises of Soviet support. But regardless, this left him in control of the capital and shattered what legitimacy the Beiyang government retained. Unfortunately for Feng, this also left him isolated and under siege by forces from the Fengxian clique into October of 1925, who, by the way, are not related to Feng despite the name. Nonetheless, the Soviets see a prospect for uniting the Kuomintang and the Kuomintang to gain control of all of the country. But to do that, the Kuomintang needs to be unified behind that plan. And in the summer of 1925, that is anything but a done deal. The right faction under Hu has now started to actively oppose continued cooperation with the communists and the USSR. Wang and Liao are still on board though, and Hu cannot overcome both of them at the same time. On August 20th, the party executive committee is to convene in Guangzhou. When Liao arrives for the meeting and steps out of his limousine, he is riddled with bullets from a group of 5 men armed with Mauser C96 semi-automatic pistols, killing him instantly. That should pave the way for Hu, but it seems that he has overestimated his power and support base. As the obvious suspect, Hu is promptly removed from power and arrested. So now Wang, as party chairman, looks like he could finally gain unilateral control. His position is, in theory, strengthened after reforms introduced by the Soviet advisors to install a more regimented control over the growing army through the MAC, the Military Affairs Council, which has also just lost half of its members, leaving Wang dominant there too. Confusing? Yes. However, the party army, by now renamed the NRA, the National Revolutionary Army, is under operative control of Chiang, who has already surged to de facto leader of the forces fused from 4 different warlord factions and now counting over 50,000 men, 10,000 of whom are under Chiang's direct command, right? During the spring and summer, together with the Red Army advisors, Chiang has allied himself with Wang, Liao, and Hu to use the power of the MAC to decrease the power of the other warlords. They have introduced much-needed reforms to streamline command, reorganize the divisional structures, and retrain the forces in the most recent battle doctrines of the Red Army forged during their massive and bloody wars of recent years. Most importantly, Chiang has been at the vanguard of financing efforts to make sure that the army is paid, loyal, well-equipped for war. He has meticulously gone through the potential income sources of the party, eradicated middlemen in trade, and taken control of any potential income sources. The party now controls taxation, foreign trade tariffs. It runs extortion schemes, provides paid security for local businesses, and has a series of its own business ventures generating immediate income, out of which the most lucrative is their monopoly on the opium trade in southern China. Chiang has made sure that the spoils of these efforts go mostly to the NRA, on the way further cementing his own position as its leader. So, although Wang is now at the top of the party on paper, in reality, he will have to share power with Chiang. For the Soviets, who at the time feel they are working well with Chiang, this situation seems to herald success for their plans to appropriate the Kuomintang into the Socialist International. They all now get busy with setting the plans in motion to finally go to war in the north. Now, Chiang's relationship with the Soviets is a bit difficult to understand, considering his position on the right flank of the party. Whether or not it is a deceit to gain the advantages of their support, or if he is truly convinced that the alliance makes sense, is hard to discern. Whichever the case, Chiang repeatedly comes under attack from the rest of the right wing during 1925 for being too cozy with the Russians. And Chiang does seem loyal to the Soviets, at times even speaking like a fellow traveler in communism. At a celebration over yet another victory over a dissenting warlord, he says, "The Chinese Revolution would fail if it did not unite with all the revolutionaries of the world." When insurrection threatened by a group inside the executive committee, calling themselves the Western Hills Group, he writes in a letter that the failure of the revolution thus far is to blame on the, quote, arrogance and corrosive jealousy as demonstrated by this group. In January 1926, his alliance with the extreme left pays off. At the Kuomintang Annual Assembly, the CPC represents 1/3 of the votes, and these votes carry Chiang to an official position on the executive committee. However, The same month, the Soviet advisors suddenly seem less convinced of how handleable Chiang really is. Now, remember, Stalin and Trotsky's ultimate goal is the appropriation of the Kuomintang to create a communist sister state in the East. Whether he knows this or not, Chiang has enjoyed a close and effective relationship with the head of his Red Army advisors, Vasily Blucher. But Vasily is replaced in November 1925 by Nikolai Kuibyshev, a veteran of the Civil War and senior of the Red Army academies. In January, Kuibyshev reports back to Stalin that it is not yet possible to obtain complete control of the Revolutionary Army. Other advisors describe Chiang as conceited, reserved, and ambitious, but that he can be handled if he is praised in a delicate manner and dealt with on the basis of equality, and never showing that one wants to usurp even a particle of his power. As the rift seems to increase, Kuibyshev shows open disdain for Chiang and his commanders, stating they seem completely ignorant of the arts of war. The same month, Chiang writes of his Russian advisors, "I treat them with sincerity, and they reciprocate with deceit." Despite this rumbling, the preparations of war continue with increasing fervor. By now, endless convoys of Russian ships are delivering thousands of tons of arms, armaments, and equipment every month in preparation for a spring offensive. Meanwhile, the anti-communist Western Hill Group continues sowing discord. They float rumors of a coup by the CPC involving Wang and the Russians to oust Chiang. If this is true or not remains contentious, but Chiang bites, and by February he is despondently writing, "I feel like I'm single-handedly fighting tigers from the front and wolves from the back. Political life is hell." In March 1926, things escalate quickly when it looks like this rumored coup is about to take place. Now, to this day, in 2019, it remains unclear if what happens is in fact meant to be a coup orchestrated by the Russians, an independent operation by the CPC, a fake by Chiang to give him an excuse to seize power, or simply just a series of misunderstandings. But whichever the case, during the night of the 18th and 19th of March, the most powerful gunship of the NRA Navy, the SS Zhongshan, suddenly leaves the port of Guangzhou and anchors off a nearby island. Chiang later claims that this alarmed him as the commander claimed to have acted on his orders. Orders Chiang says he never issued. His fears are compounded by a barrage of strange phone calls that reportedly happened on the 18th, with, among others, Wang's wife calling 5 times to Chiang's office to inquire about his planned whereabouts for the next few days. More reports of confused calls emerge, and Chiang becomes convinced that it's a plot to either kidnap him and ship him off to Vladivostok or even murder him. His, reportedly, first reaction is to run, and he books passage on a steamer to Japan, but changes his mind at the last moment. Instead, he declares martial law, cuts off the phone network for all of Guangzhou, and orders his cadets and NRA forces to arrest all political officers of the CPC. He places the Soviet advisors and Wang under house arrest. Now, Wang was in bed with a cold and a high fever, and when confronted with this situation, he is indignant and waves it off as paranoid overreaction by Chiang. On the 22nd, the executive committee convenes at Wang's house. Wang continues to claim innocence, and in a compromise, it's agreed that Wang will soon take a prolonged vacation abroad. After Wang and his family depart for Europe on April 7th, Chiang starts cleaning out communist influence in the party and NRA by removing large sections of the CPC leadership from the party's committees, forcing out their representatives at the Whampoa Academy, and demanding that several of the Soviet advisors, including Kuibyshev, return to Russia. He also removes a few token right-wing activists from the party and never openly criticizes or disdains the United Front. Instead, he brushes it all away as a limited and individual matter of a small number of members of our party who had carried out an anti-revolutionary plot. Regardless of the situation, he still desperately needs his allies in Moscow, though, to even have a remote chance of defeating the warlords in the north. The NRA now counts some 85,000 men, but that's only a tenth of the joint forces he might face once he sets off on his offensive. So even if the NRA has superior training, more arms per soldier. They're generally better equipped. He needs allies to face off those numbers. But he can't count on Feng and the Kuomintang if he doesn't have the Soviet Union at his side. So, he sends a proposal for a new deal to Moscow. The CPC shall not hold any executive positions in the Kuomintang or in the NRA. Kuybyshev shall be sent back to Russia, and only a limited amount of advisors be left behind. The political commissars in the NRA will be abolished. An extensive list of Chinese communists known to Moscow shall be handed to Chiang. Arms and equipment deliveries shall continue as planned. And finally, the Military Advisory Committee will be abolished and Chiang recognized as the sole political and military leader of the Kuomintang and the NRA. Now, that shopping list might sound like an outrageous insult to the Soviets, and many take it that way, most notably Trotsky, who immediately opposes any deal. However, Stalin decides he will go along with it, overrules Trotsky, and approves all of Chiang's demands, effectively and rather suddenly abandoning any hope to appropriate the NRA for Soviet interests. We shall never know exactly why, but perhaps he thinks he'll get another chance, or he feels the threat of the warlords in Japan is the greater of two evils, or maybe he simply admires Chiang for his balls of steel. Well, we can only speculate. So, in the process of a year, it could be construed that Chiang Kai-shek has gone from a right-wing communist sympathizer for the greater good of the Nationalist Party and the Chinese Revolution to a ruthless politician serving mainly his own interests and desire for power. His detractors and proponents still argue that point to this day. We certainly cannot tell you what went on in his mind and in his heart in these 12 months, but we can tell you this is just the beginning of a very long, bloody, and incredibly destructive process to put back together the shards of China. When we return in 1927, Chiang will have launched his northern expedition together with Wang, Feng, and Stalin. They will still be at each other's throats. Hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children will have lost their lives in the process, and China will still be broken, paving the way for yet more conflicts, invasions, and ultimately the Far Eastern Front of World War II. If you'd like to see how Chiang Kai-shek launches another offensive many years later, click here for our World War II episode covering the Chinese winter offensives of 1939 and 1940. Our TimeGhost Army member for this episode is Charles Buckley. Do like Charles and support the war effort by joining us on Patreon or at timeghost.tv. Do not forget to subscribe and press the bell. And as anyone in China would say in 1926, no matter what, stay radical, keep up the revolution.